with regards to the actors that we need to see in the market in the future that we don't see today, what do you think, what roles are those actors playing within the market, particularly like within the ecosystem, within the value chain of the voluntary carbon market? Like what gaps exist? Like what did you mean by that?
So I think that sort of transitions into a bit of a discussion of the voluntary carbon market, to be honest. And where are we at now? I think I would argue that we are in the middle of a valley of death across the market. So what does the term valley of death usually refer to? So it's usually a company or entity that is in a challenging phase of their development, right? Either running out of cash or having challenges with their finances one way or another because they are in the middle of innovation, right? So you invest in the beginning and you're waiting for your product to start earning money. I think, and that's, if you look at the car market as or the whole carbon market as a valley of death for the moment, you could say that there were several reasons for it, and all the actors are hit by it. So both investors, operators like ourselves, and the local communities that should receive funding or livelihood programs through the carbon. And none of these actors are immune. I'm happy to dive more into that, but I think that is a metaphor we can use because it's quite a normal expression in the business world, and it tells us that this market is immature.
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, and today we're joined by Kim Gabrielli, CEO of Worldview International Foundation. Before leading WIF, Kim served as CEO of the UN Global Compact, Norway, and chaired the Regional Council for Western Europe and North America. So he spent a lot of time inside the architecture of global climate governance. So Kim, it's great to have you on the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I think to start, I already touched on your career a little bit, but it would be great to introduce you to the audience. Tell us a bit about your career, being from more policy work to hands-on product development, kind of drove that career path and led you, what have you learned along the way, right?
I think the two things that brought me here. So first of all, yes, I have background from governance, from standards, from working with the United Nations Global Compact, which is the sustainable business arm of the UN. And at the same time, I'm working with UNICEF, with children's rights. So for sure, I'm very interested in that, in the governance and how we do standardizations. And the second part is something that is incredibly important, both in UNICEF and in WIF, where I'm now Worldview International Foundation, and is the combination of nature, climate, and people. UNICEF is doing that on the ground with their partners, but WIF is an implementer of planting, restoring, and protecting mangroves. So we are in the middle of this, how people and nature and climate can work together for a healthy ecosystem, a thriving population. So that's what really fascinates me and what's brought me here. And it's really nice to be a bit closer to the implementation than you are when you're working for the UN in an OECD country like Norway.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I look forward to diving into a number of topics, particularly around blue carbon and the market itself. I think to start in the first segment, I would love to talk about something that doesn't get touched on too much from market participants, and this is Article 13 within the Paris Agreement and the enhanced transparency framework. And I think 2025 was a good year for the transparency architecture. Most people in the markets know Article 6 inside and out, right? But Article 13 doesn't really get the same attention. So I wanted to start there. Why is that? Why does that gap exist? Tell us about Article 13 and why it matters for the carbon markets.
Yeah, so why that gap exists, I'm not quite sure, because perhaps there's a lot of articles in Paris, in the Paris Agreement, and Article 6 relates to finance, which we naturally first go to, right, when we want to do something. Article 13, as you rightly said, is about transparency. and it's the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement. So that means this is for states, really, right? It's not applicable directly to, for example, the voluntary carbon market. But of course, it can give us inspiration. And as the PACM Article 6 UN market, whatever we call it going forward, it will, of course, also have a direct impact on other actors. So I think perhaps four things that is important with Article 13. It is a general thing for transparency, right? So it's enhancing the trust. The more transparency there is, more the trust in the market. Promote accountability through transparency. You get more accountability. You can follow, is things actually happening? You can track the progress better because there's more openness around it, right? And the fourth thing that is more specific to this is, of course, the development, countries in development that are going to get climate finance, for example, through Article 6, they will have to show it clearer through this transparency framework. And we can talk more into it, but I think that's sort of the overall start of it, Eddie, the way I see it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I would love to hear more of your kind of in-depth insights about the framework itself, right? I mean, because there's lots of measures I think in place or kind of developing around transparency and accountability. But what is the actual framework itself do in that regard to, yeah,
Yeah, so I
specifically?
think it's fair to say that there is almost a red line in the sand before the Paris Agreement and after, right? So we didn't have good enough common standards for countries to report on their climate goals, right? So that's one of the things that Article 13 is introducing. It's introducing to report national on the NDCs, the national climate goals for governments, to do it on every second year. It's you're having different kinds of reporting mechanisms built into it, which was not there before Article 13 basically came with the Paris Agreement. So for that, it's very, very important. And there is different kinds of reporting built into the circles of reporting in the UN, basically, right? And it's also introducing things like the national climate goals, which is now being more and more related to, for example, mangrove restoration. So we are looking to that when we're doing mangrove restoration in a country. But the NDCs, as they're called, they're not directly linked to today to the carbon, which is a challenge, right? We're seeing that we are trying to do it, but there is not a clear link as long as you have one Article 6 market coming up and at the same time a voluntary market. So, but yes, absolutely. These biannual reports from the states, the GA inventory on how much emissions do the state actually have, are also part of that. So we could go deeper into it, but I think the overall is like more reporting, clearer goal on the national level, and also then that giving a global overview of how much emissions states across member states across the UN actually have.
Yeah. And, from COP30, there was a few, high level dialogues on transparency, right? And the first kind of BTR synthesis report was released. I guess the question now is whether all this reporting machinery is actually driving ambition and accountability, or whether it's becoming sort of a procedural exercise disconnected from.
Yeah, so I got that question from you in advance, and I was thinking about that because, yes, of course, transparency drives accountability, right? Because it gives increased visibility and public pressure, and you are kept accountable. The state can be kept accountable. However, I think the relationship between transparency and ambition is much more complex because you can be kept accountable, but still not have the political will to do something. Because here in this context, we talk about the states, right? The governments. So that is a challenge here, right? Like if there is no political will to do changes, you will continue to have implementing gaps of what is needed, right? And then you potentially not get ambition you want or the results you want. In addition to that, and this is something we also see in the voluntary carbon market, is there is perhaps a gap between the actors we have today and the actors we need to have in the future. So it's basically about how do you scale the solutions. So if you have a small mangrove operator, right, that plants 4 hectares of mangroves, that is great, but that is still some thousands of mangroves. But if you have, we are perhaps a middle-sized going into large investment operator that can receive large investments operators. We can deliver much more. So we have in Worldview, we have planted approximately 45 million trees together with partners like local community, basically with financing from investors, right? So this is the question. There is, yes, it leads to ambition if there's political will and if you have the right actors to implement what you see. But what we see in many countries still is that we know what we need to do from a climate perspective, but it's not being done. And then transparency does not bring ambition sufficiently. But last thing, we have seen since the Paris Agreement came into place, we have seen a radical positive change of political will and the way the world works. Right? So yes, goals, ambitions and transparency also creates results at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think in 2005, there were less than 10 carbon pricing schemes in operation globally. And now today, 20 years later, there are over 80 carbon pricing schemes across emissions trading systems, carbon taxes, crediting mechanisms. There are over 80 in operation today, covering about roughly a fourth to a third of greenhouse gas emissions. Even with that increased, with these increased policies, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, as you mentioned, and there's still a large gap that we see today. With regards to the actors that we need to see in the market in the future that we don't see today, what do you think? What roles are those actors playing within the market, particularly like within the ecosystem, within the value chain of the voluntary carbon market? Like what gaps exist? Like what did you mean by that?
So I think that sort of transitions into a discussion of the voluntary carbon market, to be honest. And where are we at
Right.
now? I think I would argue that we are in the middle of a valley of death across the market. So what does the term valley of death usually refer to? So it's usually a company or entity that is in a challenging phase of their development, right? Either running out of cash or having challenges with their finances one way or another because they are in the middle of innovation, right? So you invest in the beginning and you're waiting for your product to start earning money. I think, and that's, if you look at the car market as or the whole carbon market as a valley of death for the moment, you could say that there were several reasons for it, and all the actors are hit by it. So both investors, operators like ourselves, and the local communities that should receive funding or livelihood programs through the carbon. And none of these actors are immune. I'm happy to dive more into that, but I think that is a metaphor we can use because it's quite a normal expression in the business world. And it tells us
Yeah.
that this market is immature.
Yeah. I've seen that term used, I think in the, the startup venture capital kind of ecosystem, right? With firms like kind of A16Z and General Catalyst. I've heard some guys, um, talk about this valley of death. And yeah, I think, it is the market is in a bit of a recalibration, or kind of a supply side reset. At the end of the day, I think the voluntary aspect is what is going to keep the kind of the stagnation. I think compliance is really what's growing the demand, and that's really essential for the market. But I think shifting gears into mangroves in with regards to the voluntary carbon market. I mean, this is an area that has quite some success, I would say, within the voluntary market. Blue carbon is one of the smallest uh, but fastest growing project types within the VCM. So it represents roughly, 0.2% of total issuances last year in 2025. And, there are really no spot credits that people can find on the markets to retire because they're so sought after high quality mangrove projects. And there's only about 10 actively issuing credits globally today. And this is an area that WIF and your team has a operational experience, with the Myanmar project, right? Alone covers 1,500 hectares. So tell me about the blue, your thoughts on the blue carbon market and where it's of the history and kind of where it's heading with regards to voluntary corporate, you know.
Yes. So this is the reason why I mentioned the sort of the metaphor of the value of death, because the whole carbon market are maturing. It's under pressure from several fronts, and the same goes for the blue carbon market. It's a small one, small part of it. And why is it a small part? One of the reasons is that, of course, it's a very specific. Most of it is mangroves, right? But at the same time, it's also because it's highly complex. So it's more difficult to plant mangroves than some other trees, for example. And it's also it's an area of high risk. I mean, the erosion and sea level rise will hit the coastal populations first, right? But to talk to that, I think what we have been seeing in our case is that we've been able to go from philanthropic smaller projects to do a bit larger projects. From 2015 onwards, we are scaling the first blue carbon project with Vera in Asia. And we'll be going on, and it has served us well in the work to plant mangroves. There is appetite for it. But we talked about the missing actors, right? That's on a general note on a change, but that is also the case with regards to the blue carbon market. Because there's not too many of us, right? There's not that many actors that actually are able to scale. And to use another financial term, or is I think we're missing the missing middle, the one that we have to go from a situation where you have some smaller actors doing 100, 200 hectares to like us that have restored close to 20,000 hectares now. And how do we get there, right? And how do we get beyond that? How do we get beyond 20,000 hectares, but to 10 to 100,000 hectares? And that is first, I think we need to get out of the situation we are in now, where we have a lot of pressures on the market. So it's much the regulatory side, political side. Changes in methodologies makes it also challenging. We have had change with Vera, for example, which is the right thing to do. More scrutiny, more integrity, but it's complex. And this sort of changes in methodology and higher integrity across environmental, local community, nature, and all of that is putting a short-term pressure now because it delays credits coming out, right? But we in WIF, we are very happy. If we look forward to working on this is the core for us. Integrity and accountability, transparency is really, really at the core of this to make sure that we can show the results that are happening. But it puts short-term pressure on many actors, also investors and local community in addition to operate. But in the long term, it's good for the market, right? And that's, I think, what we've seen in the carbon market this year is for the first time, perhaps at least in that size, integrity starts to mean something for rating companies, I mean, it has always meant a lot, but it means something for the price of the credits. That's what I'm trying to say. So credits like ours go up, as credits that has less accountability and transparency through a standards body like Vera or Gold Standard are going down. So I think, yes, we are in the middle of market shift in a way, and that put pressure on the actors. But our ambition is to go from a place where we are, on the way to we can scale it to really large areas to be that missing middle. And we need more actors to move into that and operators, because the finance investment seems to be the interest to buy carbon credit seems to be really high now with the large corps, for example, but there's not enough operators to deliver on that, at least not in the mangrove space.
Yeah, I mean, from my understanding, speaking with a wide variety of mangrove developers, I mean, mangrove projects are very, very complex and very difficult to do exceptionally well. Um, I read one of WIF's articles on how kind of the projects achieve a mangrove survival rate of over 90%, right? And that's genuinely an exceptional metric in the restoration space. I mean, why do you think so many projects underperform on this metric in mangroves, the survival rate, and kind of what's WIF doing differently?
So I think you're talking to an important thing here. So this is what we have been until now. One of the things that has always been mentioned as a success factor in mangroves is survival rate. And many mangrove projects has the maximum of 70 to 80%. Why has WIF done it better than that? Perhaps, not perhaps, but because we have experienced, I mean, since 2015, when we started with the first Vera project in 2015, we had already tested out our work for 3 years. We're planting, head of planting, since 2015, he planted his first mangrove in 1981. I was 1 year old when he planted his first mangrove. In this field, experience means a lot. And that's what we've seen. And in addition to that, we have SOP, standard procedures for everything. We have, I think the last time I counted was like 38 of them. So there is a lot of quality and experience that got into that. While many other mangrove operators are starting now or started 2-3 years ago, right? So it makes sense that they will need time to get better at it. So in addition to that, I would say that everybody always talked about 90% or survival rate, right? Now, when we talk about integrity, we are also talking about the environmental side of things beyond only of course, the sequestration of the CO2. We are also talking about the nature. We are focusing on the labels in Vera, where you can add on indicators on nature. The social, of course, has always been there for us in a benefit sharing model with the local communities, which has always been the DNA of Worldview since 1979. And of course, governance and finance. So when I'm saying we are transitioning into become one of these missing middle organization, we've been on that track for a while to look at different way of infrastructure in the in how we're operating, SPVs, better governance oversight. I think this is something that many operators need to look at because we've gone from being pioneers to now going to be like a pipeline operator, and we are on that track just now, in middle of finalizing some of our steps to be able to receive more funds and scale more at a sustainable way. So that's where we are now. And I think there are some other operators at the same place. And then integrity and governance becomes extremely important. To follow up what we talked about at the beginning, the transparency framework, basically, not only for states, but also for operators and other actors in the carbon voluntary market.
Yeah, certainly. And you touched on how kind of the higher integrity, higher quality credits, we're seeing kind of divergent pricing this past year. And we've seen that, we had Calyx Global on the podcast discussing how kind of higher rated credits in tier A, we're seeing higher pricing than the lower tiers. And given that you touched on methodology evolution and kind of buyer expectations, you're on Vera, and we saw that Gold Standard also released a new kind of sustainable management of mangroves methodology in 2024 that incorporates remote sensing. And obviously buyers have gotten more sophisticated since the market's integrity crisis a few years ago. The ICVCM label is increasingly being positioned as the integrity benchmark. And since WIF's projects run under the VCS, now how are you thinking about the CCP pathway, and does the label actually matter to your buyers in practice?
Yeah, so you said the CCB, right?
CCP, like core carbon principle, the
Oh, yeah, of
ICVCM?
course. Yeah, no. Yeah, I thought you would talk about.
No, not CCP.
Yes, of course. I mean, so one of the challenges we see now in general is that, so like you started out saying, that blue carbon projects are one of the smaller parts of the carbon market, right? So both for Article 6 alignment and for CCP, the methodologies that we are using tend to be the latest one in the queue, right? So we are to be aligned with the methodology by Vera, for example. So yes, absolutely, we need to fit with new standards and new principles that have come out or are coming out, right? But that is part of the pressure I talked about on the operators, right? Because we have started out as pioneers, as somebody that delivers quickly action, like a startup, right? Some years back. And then you are step by step going into being incredibly good at the operation itself. And then you have to align that also with the standards and the transparency, accountability of new methodologies. But all the work you've done has been based on the old standards, right? So that's where I think many operators are moving. But yes, absolutely, we are moving towards that as well as many others. But there is a gap here, right? Before you get the methodologies are aligned either with Vera and gold standard, and also before the operators can implement all the new, if there are any new data that is needed, for example, because we need to have it historically measure it over time. But we are very positive to all of this, and short-term pressure, long-term gain for all of us to make the market better and higher quality.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I've heard from ratings as well that the kind of goalposts kind of keep shifting for a lot of the developers that are trying to just play by the rules. So there are kind of debates to be had on both sides. But going back to kind of the blue carbon market and how it's a small part of the VCM today, right? Most host countries don't include coastal ecosystems in their national greenhouse gas inventories, right? Which means there's no corresponding adjustments really happening at the needed scale in order to unlock that supply, and which
Actually,
poses a risk.
there was actually a change on that in COP30. So we're seeing many more. I don't have the exact number now, but we have seen many more countries, including Mangroves, for example, in the NDCs. I think we are looking at 70 countries now, which is a huge. Yeah, I think so. This can double check the numbers, but it's a big leap forward, which happened in COP30 on the NDCs. So yes, in principle, you're right, and there are many more countries, but it is a stroking number anyway, right? Because right, anyway, because the ocean is so important for CO2 sequestration, and it's also the coastal communities that will be hit first in many cases by the climate change. So it is rare, and it's strange in a way, but it's changing, I
Yeah,
think.
no, of course, and I mean these are essential, projects in every regard to resilience and ecosystem rehabilitation. But I'm just speaking to, I guess, the corresponding adjustment aspect. The main challenge is getting those, like we saw, I think, the other week with cocoa. This kind of there's a risk that some of these projects don't actually get the corresponding adjustment from the host government like were expecting to, right? And I just wanted to ask about WIF's kind of viewpoint on the that situation and that risk about the corresponding adjustment risk, right? And how to manage that. Is that one that buyers, because some buyers, on our end are actively asking about that, right? And with regards to, Corsia for example, right? I mean, that's the kind of elephant in the room. But
So on that, we have been focusing on countries where we have been discussing the work with, working with governments, right? So that is for us for the moment, Malaysia, Myanmar, Panama, where we have had the closest discussions. All these countries, the mangroves are part of the NDCs now. Indonesia introduced it as part of their NDCs in as well. It was launched, I think, just after the part on the mangroves. So we haven't, because of that. Currently, we don't see that as a challenge on mangrove space, right? But it is on a general term further, further globally, it is an issue. But we've been very specific in our approach, right? Because we are in these jurisdictions, and so the Global Mangrove Alliance and the Mangrove Breakthrough, which are two of our international organizations, they have been focusing on this since some COPs back. Some COP29, they already hosted several sessions with member states of the UN, so countries, on this topic. So I think it's evolving. For us, for the moment at least, I don't foresee this to be a challenge where it can't be integrated into. I mean, if you see a national market or a combination of a national market with influenced by the Article 6 market, right? Regulations.
yeah. Yeah, and I do want to get, kind of shift over to kind of some more forward-looking points like we kind of discussed before. I mean, 2025, quite a difficult year for many developers in the nature restoration space, right? Like we talked about this kind of pressure. I'm curious to know what actually happened in your kind of conversation with WIF's conversations with buyers, and like what gave, the conviction to kind of continue and really, make things work.
I think we touched upon it already. It's simplified. It's twofold. Very simplified. It's transparency part and it's finance. The transparency is linked to integrity, right? So integrity, transparency, and finance. So we are setting ourselves up to be ready to receive 15 to 20 million USD for one project, right? Which is a larger ticket than we have had before. To do that, we are transitioning both our own transparency framework. So that is one of when I got in as a CEO 1.5 years ago, I had three topics as my main for the internal use, but it's not very secret. It was transparency, trust, and impact. And it aligns really well with what we're seeing now. So we are working now, we'll reach out to our investors now also to discuss this in more detail. So that's number one. And different infrastructures. I think one of the problems in the carbon is the infrastructure as such. It's both standards bodies, like we might see a disruption or some other actors coming in, and also seeing the MRV, the monitoring, reporting, verification getting better, so we can get this perhaps digitally with gold standards and better. And we will see basically better standards, better operators, and better transparency. And those operators and investors that are not able to follow that, they will drop off, I think, as it's quite normal in the market. Our ambition is to lead in that area, in our small part, mangroves. So I think that's the future for us. So really increased integrity and increased finance will give us the ability to do what we do best, which is to create a future for coastal communities where they can thrive together with healthy ecosystems, right? That's sort of what we are doing. The crossroads, as I started, between nature, climate, and people. And we can only do that if we partner with both local communities and investors. And then integrity gets really, really important, and transparency.
Yeah, 100%. I really like that, what you said about the community, right? Because it is a big risk to the communities as well, kind of the opportunity costs of their land. And I feel like a lot of the kind of risk is talked about too much from the corporate lens and not as much from the community lens, which are, the real kind of risk, right? I see you kind of like nodding your head. Do you have any points on that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think this is spot on, right? So we came to the carbon market from being a development organization for local livelihood, right? We did not come there we are non-profit. We didn't get there to get any, earnings on this, right? That's what we did from 1979 to 2012. We had different development projects across more than 25 countries, many related to coastal communities, others to other kinds of local communities. For us, the carbon market is a tool to be able to give local communities better livelihood and better development, as well as working on the nature and climate crisis. So that's where we are coming from. And this, I think, is not always the case in the carbon market, right? And what we're seeing now, which is really worrying me, there's a lot to talk about delays in credits, not giving funds back to investors. But what is equally challenging is that you commit to local communities. Yes, that's 3, 4, 5 years, we will get the carbon credit. So you can do, different kinds of income generation activities, livelihood activities with those funds, and it's being delayed. That put a pressure for us or for them in the local communities together with us on protecting the mangroves that is potentially an income source for local communities. So, I mean, in other forms than carbon projects. So this is one of the biggest issues in the carbon market now is the delays in credits. It puts pressures on everybody. Investors are not happy. We get pressure as all operators on our funds, and the local communities don't get what they were promised. And this is really, really some of the challenges that is there.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, this is kind of one of the biggest bottlenecks on the supply side. And we're seeing kind of the evolution of the digitalization of the market happen in real time with regards to digital technology. And I hope we start to see kind of AI have transformed the speed and scale to which developers can bring their credits to market. But and what would you say are some of the key solutions that are needed to kind of attack this problem of structural kind of issuance bottlenecks, right? Because I mean, this is a real challenge that we're seeing for a lot of developers with these delays, right? What do you think? What do you think needs to be done?
Well, so I think you're touching on it, like DMRV, so digitalization of the standards bodies. And so
Mhm.
we've been mainly working with Vera in our past. The CEO Mandy that was also here with you, I think she's been, pushing forward to digitalize. But I think Vera and Gold Standards others are meeting some of the challenges as us. You want to digitalize at the same time as standards are changing. So for sure, digitalization is one of the biggest issues, and also different kinds of sensing, AI, how do you measure? It's challenging. There's a specific challenge for mangroves where 80% of the carbon is underneath. I mean, it's in the soil, right? Potentially. So it's a bit more difficult to use some of the sensors that you can use on the 20% of the tree. In the mangrove space, 80% in other trees often over the ground. But yes, it's somewhere between digitalization of the basics data in the standards bodies and AI, different kinds of tools to measure more in real, right? I think these are the most important things that we're seeing. At the same time, is alignment across standards, frameworks, and regulations. We're hoping that we will see that with SCPs and with PACM UN market. So these two things, digitalization and the standards. And then number three, for sure, regulations is a challenge. When there is if we want to get finance to do more mangroves, we need to have the land rights. There's a lot of skepticism and perhaps for good reasons amongst government to give land rights, right? It's a very long process, 2-3 years, and it's very bureaucratic. So this is actually one of the really bottlenecks for us. It's even though we are one of the most experienced and have track record. You can just imagine how it is get land rights and carbon rights for not as experienced actors as ourselves. Many countries are still working on their regulations, right? I mean, Indonesia is a good example that had a moratorium for many years and now has been launching more and more of the regulatory framework. But it has been taking 3-4 years. It's perhaps natural from a bureaucratic political perspective, but if you actually want to implement, which we've been doing, should you wait 3 to 4 years before you can start? So these three things, regulatory standards and digitalization, are going to be key to AI.
Well, look, I think we could talk about all those topics for another few hours, but
Sure. Yeah.
I don't want to take up too much of your time. But Kim, this has been an incredibly valuable conversation, and I think your perspective, as someone that has shaped kind of the global policy architecture from inside to now kind of the architecture work in the mud, literally in
Yeah.
mangroves. The work WIF is doing is critical, and I hope our audience goes away understanding the scale of the opportunity and the gap between ambition and execution. So I really appreciate you for joining us, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. And we'll catch you next week on This Week in Carbon.
Thank you.
Thank you.